Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Welcome to No One Told Us, the podcast that tells the truth about parenting and talks about all the stuff you wish you knew before having kids. I'm your host, Rachael, and today I'm speaking with Elissa Strauss. Elissa has been writing about the politics and culture of parenting and caregiving for more than 15 years. Her work appears in publications like The Atlantic, The New York Times, Glamour, ELLE, and elsewhere, and she was a former contributing writer at CNN.com and Slate. Her new book, When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others, is out now, and she's also a mom of two. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. This is something that I am just endlessly fascinated about, the culture and the societal expectations that are placed on mothers. So I'm so happy that you wrote this book, and I'm so honored to have you here today. Thanks for joining, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction, and I'm really excited to be here.
So I actually first discovered you on Substack. I just devoured a bunch of your pieces and then learned about your book on there. What kind of got you first interested in writing about this topic of caregiving, and what inspired the book?
So it kind of came from two epiphanies that seem separate, but in the end were very connected. So for a long time, I was really on the why don't we support parents beat. I just felt like I was writing article after article of why don't we have paid leave? Why don't we have universal, affordable, and reliable childcare, child tax credits? All the things we all know and yet still don't have. And I reached a point where I felt like I couldn't write one more story about it, not because it doesn't matter, not because it's still not a very pressing issue and it doesn't need to be written about, just that it seemed like there was something deeper going on. How, again, do we not have paid leave? It's such an obvious thing that a parent should not have to pick between paying their mortgage or their rent and caring for a newborn or caring for a sick relative, that to me it was clear it wasn't just a policy issue, this was a cultural issue. And so I felt really excited and inspired and motivated to kind of dig this up by its roots, looking into why our culture made it so we could have such a giant blind spot to care.
Right.
At the same time, when I became a mom, I was excited about becoming a mom. I didn't have ambivalence about whether or not I wanted to be a parent. And I also was lucky enough when my first son was born, Augie, I didn't have postpartum depression. I didn't have ambivalence about wanting to be with him or loving him. But I had deep ambivalence about what being a mom would do to me as a person overall in the world. And I was really worried about everything that being a mom would take away from me. And particularly for me, that really meant my place in the kind of hip, literary, intellectual scene in Brooklyn where I lived at the time. And at some point, and this took a couple of years, it took actually the act of parenting this child and having a relationship with this child and realizing that parenting is actually this big, full, wonderful, challenging, rich, transcendent, annoying, everything experience, for me to realize that my fear of motherhood kind of ruining me, publicly speaking, culturally speaking, was really tapped into that same blind spot towards care that was behind us not having paid leave. In short, I realized we live in a culture that doesn't really value care and doesn't really have curiosity about what it means to care for another. And also, I, Elissa Strauss, the feminist who wrote about motherhood, actually really didn't value care or have deep curiosity about care myself.
You've mentioned that motherhood is often presented as either a fairy tale or a nightmare, and that correction can become an overcorrection. And so I'm curious what your own experience was like, and maybe you had a different experience with each postpartum, but was it closer to a fairy tale or closer to a nightmare?
I think I push against that framing because I really feel like it was neither. It was truly neither. It was all of the above, right? And often at once. So my initial postpartum experience with Augie was crappy. I mean, I often say it and I express it like a joke, but I actually am kind of serious. Like, if I could have fast forwarded to the first 6 months of my son's lives and not done that early, newborn parenting, I might have chosen that if that was like an ethically and biologically, scientifically possible option.
I don't think you're alone in that.
I may have checked that box. So Augie was really tough. My husband didn't have paid parental leave. I didn't have paid leave with either kid because I've always been a freelancer contract writer. I was very much alone all day in our apartment in Brooklyn. Augie was born during Hurricane Sandy, so the vibes in New York were not great, right? It was a kind of dark, chaotic time to begin with. I couldn't breastfeed, and I had what felt like to me was not healthy breastfeeding support. I had support that told me just to keep doing more, and ignoring the fact that I was alone all day with a newborn. And I mean, I felt like my house was, I would joke, called it the meth lab. Like, there were just the tubes and then this and then that. I'm always cleaning everything. It's like everything felt so precarious. And at some point, I realized, I was like, Augie, you have to stop crying because I have to pump for an hour after every feeding. And then I like ignoring my baby. And I was like, oh, wait, what? Like, this was the support I was given that was essentially giving me this impossible task to feed him, and it entirely came at his expense of just like his mom holding him.
Oh my God.
So I can laugh about it now, but that was awful and was devastating. So that was really rough, and really didn't have any support network around. With Levi, my husband had paid leave, and truly, I can't emphasize enough. I am a writer, and I really don't feel like I have words to express the night and day experience of having my husband around during the day with a newborn versus being alone.
Yeah.
It wasn't that bad. I mean, you're exhausted and all the things that a newborn brings, but when you just constantly have someone to pass the baby to so you can make yourself actual food or rest for an hour, it just, again, I really don't feel like I've even managed to put in words what a truly, truly fundamentally different night and day experience it was between Augie and Levi. And partially because I didn't kill myself about the breastfeeding with Levi. I kind of knew I wasn't going to make a lot of milk. I kind of tried. I put in a little effort, but I wasn't going to lose my mind about it. But the big picture difference was that Nathaniel was around and I had what we needed, just support.
I mean, I think that's been researched, and it's been shown that having parental leave drastically improves maternal mental health. What you describe, so many listeners, unfortunately, can probably resonate with. I remember the exact same, tracking my husband's location on my phone. The second it turned 5 o'clock, just please get home as fast as possible. I can't be alone with this baby for one more second. It was, really, really hard. And you write in the book about, kind of this obsession in our culture to go it alone and to do everything alone. We're very individualistic here. And I'm curious what you gleaned from the writing process of this book about why we're like that and why other places are not. So we're going to discuss that right when we come back. Okay, we're back with Elissa Strauss, and right before the break I asked, so why are we like this? Why are we so individualistic here, especially when it comes to raising children? And what do other places do differently, or how do they believe caregiving should be that makes such a huge difference?
I think the individualism in America is really back to this kind of roots metaphor. It really is something that goes down to our roots. All of our big narratives that we read, the big books in high school curriculum feature kind of men leaving home to find truth and live, quote unquote, real life, whether it's Henry David Thoreau at the pond at Walden. Huck Finn is terrified of being civilized by the widow Douglas is the first page of the book. He has to get out. So it is so deep in our culture that real life happens outside the house. It happens when we're on our own or maybe with a buddy, but not in a care relationship, to go find truth and meaning and have adventure. So I think that's one layer of it. I think another big layer of what we see in our culture is the patriarchy, right? It's like care has been women's work, and there's been this need to kind of idealize it, that it's just this perfect, harmonious, easy thing, and therefore women don't need help. And I think that is just probably the biggest problem. And I always hit home on this point, that it's not just that we don't support caregivers, we don't have curiosity about care. Because if we have curiosity about care, we understand the breadth and depth of what happens when we care for babies or care for older children or anyone else. And we see it as something that not just like needs support, but it's actually insane not to support. It goes from like just even the tiniest bit of curiosity into what it's like for a new mom changes the whole framing on it. And I think the last thing I'd say about our culture of like why we're so individualistic, it's also because we just have a deep fear of vulnerability and dependency. Right now, for example, we have just kind of the richest men in America, some of the tech titans. They are using their money to try to live forever. That's like the hobby. It's like, how can I? There's a popular book right now called Outlive. I haven't read it. I don't want to diss it. It may have tons of beautiful advice that I would benefit from. It probably does. But there's something in our culture right now that like the big thing that you're seeking is immortality, right? You want to be strong forever. We don't want to age. All this stuff connects to our blind spot towards care. We just want to ignore the parts of life where one human depends on another human. And we want to ignore the person getting that care. I mean, I think you live in the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. My husband just was biking around with our kids in San Francisco yesterday and couldn't find a bus to take their bikes because buses only allow for 2 bikes. It's just one of these like caregiver blind spots. Like he's just a parent of 2 kids. Right. He could not, so these things are woven into our culture through and through. Right. So we ignore both the person who needs care. We're ignoring the kids who might want to have a bike riding adventure around the city with a parent because they need a parent because they're dependent. And we ignore the parent who wants to be able to be in the world with their kids and have support in a kind of structural sense and an individual sense of their kids. But we also would rather not have that crying baby in the restaurant or have the crying baby on a plane or don't invite kids to weddings because they ruin everything. I mean, all this stuff we internalize so deeply and it adds so much stress to what we call the maternal load. Yeah. Yeah, you just reminded me. I mean, I'm on TikTok for, against my better judgment. And I do see, maybe it's rage bait. Maybe it's how a lot of people really feel. I don't know. But there is a lot of like anti-kid, anti-mother, anti-family content. And it's sometimes from people who are child-free, but not even always. Sometimes it is coming from fellow parents. And it's, like you said, this rhetoric of babies aren't allowed on planes. Babies shouldn't be allowed in restaurants. You can't bring special food to restaurants to accommodate your child. They just shouldn't be there at all. All this stuff. And I can't help but look through the comments when I see posts like that, and I do see so many people saying things like, oh my gosh, in my country, it's not like this. Like, this is so American. And I don't know how to wrap my head around how we dig ourselves out of this. Yeah, I think a big thing that helped me when I was first having kids was a lot of my friends in New York were not from the States, Italian friends and Israeli friends, and there's such a more collective approach to parenting. Mm. Before I had kids, I remember I went to a friend's house and I saw this adult woman interacting with her kids. And I was like, oh, that's her sister. Like, this is their aunt, 100%. Like, who else would feel not just like familiar and playful and joyful with the kids, but yell at them too. Be like, no, you guys need to stop. Your mom just told you to have dinner. Like, go over there now. And then I learned later that woman was actually a total stranger. It's the first time she ever met the kids. And that just blew my mind. And and having these friends and being in these circles, even though it's in the States, it gave this whole other way, gave me a whole other way to view what it could be like to like parent in public and feel a little righteous about it, because I see these other friends are bringing their kids to museums and just like insisting that kids belong in public spaces, because when kids aren't allowed there, their parents and caregivers aren't allowed there too. And when their parents and caregivers aren't allowed there, their parents and caregivers feel shut out of society and as if they don't matter. So I had a little like moxie really with just kind of showing up and trying to create that for myself, having these friends who come from these less individualistic, less anti-child societies model it for me.
Yeah, I think that's probably so helpful. And so what are the benefits? Did you, I know you researched a ton for this book. Did you find like clear-cut benefits? I think in the US, we talk about it in this wistful way of like, oh, we need a village. We don't have a village. And other countries do. And so what do they do that's so different? And what are the benefits to raising your kids in that way, in that like kind of communal way where everybody's got their eyes on them and everybody feels responsible for them? It's like that collective care.
I think it gives you tremendous caregiver relief. I think it gives you also, I can't emphasize this one enough. So it's right, it's practical relief. It's just like someone else to pick it up sometimes. It gives you humility. And I really want to dig into that one a little bit because I think so much of the siloed parenting and then maybe you're seeing stuff on social media, but you're not actually living and parenting alongside other parents. You can have a real rigid sense of what this parenting thing should look like, how your children should be, and then feel terrible when it doesn't measure up. And the closer you are with real people, like really seeing that every family has their struggles. Kids are just different. We do what we can as parents. I do believe parenting matters. And I also believe that kids are really different. And you witness other styles of parenting. Your kids witness other styles of parenting. You realize that kids just have strengths and weaknesses. And we do what we can to support the strengths and help them with their weaknesses. And we also have to reckon with the fact that they come out, as they are a little bit. And with that humility, with that humility can almost come like deepen our sense of appreciation and awe for what this whole thing is. Because we get out of that comparative mind frame and we realize that this is this very mysterious, very difficult process that we call parenting now, right? That is like raising little humans, and the whole context changes.
Yeah, I was just interviewing someone who's a friendship expert, and we were talking about, why it's so hard for particularly women, and particularly when they become moms, it's why it's so hard for us to make friends and maintain friends. And one of the big reasons, and I hear this all the time on my sleep page, Hey Sleepy Baby, is like, my friend is making this choice that I don't agree with for their baby's sleep. And I'm just like, people parent so differently everywhere, like whether or not you're aware of it. And I get it, like I get it to a certain degree, but I do think kind of like what you were just saying about so many of us are parenting in isolation, and all we know is what we are doing and what people are showing on social media. And we're not seeing all the messiness and all the variety of ways to be a good parent. There's no one way to be a good parent. There's no one choice that works for everybody. And I think it's so interesting that people get so hung up on that. And it's to our detriment, really.
Right. And imagine if we did this with marriage, right? Like imagine if we were always watching each other's marriages and thought like, oh, I can't believe they do that. We don't do that. We totally understand these are just like two unique adults in their own relationship, figuring out a marriage that works for them. Our relationships with our kids are not that much different, right? I mean, it's not totally the same as marriage, but like I, Elissa, am the mom to Levi and Augie. There's no one else like them in the world. There's no one else like me in the world with my family history and my strengths and weaknesses. And then so we have those two pieces. And then we have also like the unique relationship that is between us that works for us. So I think that's the other big thing too. Like it's back to this curiosity thing. It's curiosity and generosity, right? We don't give it to ourselves and we don't give it to others. And then you get stuck in this cycle where you think every little thing is so high stakes, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but it becomes so high stakes in your mind that, right, the possibility that there's another way to do it, you can't even tolerate it. And I think that's when you parent collectively, you just build up a tolerance for it, whether you like it or not. And I want to throw in, our experience parenting during the pandemic, because obviously the pandemic sucked in many ways. But one thing that happened is a lot of us kind of formed, these informal pods, so to speak. You're like, all right, these are the families that we're just going to decide to trust on some level. And even if we don't really, just roll with it, because we can't be fully in isolation for whatever, 2+ years here. So we became very, very close with a handful of other families. And through that, we lost opportunities to broaden our social networks for sure. But at the same time, we deepened intimacy and got that window into what life is really like for other families. And that, I think, ultimately did so much of this work that I'm talking about for me, of just really accepting that people do this differently. How I parent my kids is not going to work for their kids. My kids were pretty good sleepers, honestly. It's like, I'm like, who am I to opine on people who have kids that struggle sleeping? Like, I don't know, so it really just brought it all home in a deep way that I think was so good for me.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier too, how this collectivist way of parenting and this community care just gives parents a break, which we so desperately need. And I want to talk a little bit more about that when we come back. We'll take one more quick break. So, Elissa, I know you also talk a lot about the intersections of work and paid work and motherhood. You wrote a great piece on your Substack that I loved about how having kids changed your career. I would love for you to kind of unpack that a little bit for us, because I think the care crisis in our country and having very limited access to quality options, to affordable options, is really making parents kind of burnt out. And, we say all the time we want a village to help us raise our kids, but it's not really that easy.
Oh, it's not easy at all. And it puts, I think, it's one of these things that can easily put pressure back on the parents. It's like, oh, so I'm supposed to manage having a job and be a decent parent and like keep my house, in some reasonable shape. It doesn't have to be perfect, but also like you do need to clean a little bit when you have kids. They make a disgusting mess. At some point you're going to wipe the spaghetti sauce off the wall. Right. So, I know we're trying not to create expectations of these perfect houses, but at the end of the day, there is domestic labor that kind of doesn't have to be done. Yeah, dishes need to be washed. So you're doing all this, and then on top of that, somehow you're magically supposed to create this like beautiful community where your kids are roaming free in fields all day and riding their bikes, and there's always an open pair of arms to pass your baby to, or feed your 6-year-old dinner. Yeah, like, yeah. I mean, I would like it too. I really would. Not our reality. So I think that it is really important to not put the pressure on ourselves that it's like up to us to build it, but just try to slowly and surely change our attitudes about care and really believe that this work matters and that this is like a way to connect with other humans and bring that into the world. So I'll explain a little bit of what that meant for me in terms of how kind of care changed me professionally speaking in ways that I didn't expect. So I, for much of the 2010s, was, a hot take writer, but I was a blogger. I wrote for Slate, I wrote for Jezebel, and I would come up with an idea in the morning, and by the end of the day, it would be, a spicy hot take with a really firm opinion, and I was incredibly certain of myself. I was, mostly with a kind of feminist lens. And what happened to me with parenting is that by getting to know Augie as a human, I had this great epiphany, and it's touching upon what things I've said before, that people are different than us, that there are different ways to see things. I think that act of humility and also that sense that actually like the world's much bigger and more exciting once I kind of leave my subjective reality and try to enter my kid's subjective reality. I'm really trying to see the world through his eyes became this expansive exercise. And what happened is I began to see my work a little differently. I'd sit down to write these hot takes. They've since gone out of style, so it's not, it's not a living anymore than, a job you can have anymore that really makes a living. But it was a decent living back in the 10s. And I'd sit down and I'd kind of doubt. I would say like, maybe I'm not so sure about this point. Maybe I'm feeling overly certain about this. And it just it was kind of a slow moving process, and it really took off more and more the more he began to speak, because, right, a pre-verbal child, you have to work really hard to understand their needs, but the specificity of who they are becomes much more clear once they're talking. And suddenly I have this kid, and he's not just like a baby that needs to be shushed and fed, or a toddler that needs to get energy out at the right doses and rest in the right doses and get snacks and, sing little songs. He's just this like whole other person. And that's crazy. And he's not an idea. He's real. And for me, that really changed my whole approach to writing in a way that I think, in some ways has hurt me, because people do like really strong, firm opinions on the internet, even if blogging and hot take culture is over. But I think mostly it helped me because it made the world much bigger, and it allowed me to see caring for him as an exploration instead of something I already knew and just like a checklist that I had to check off every box. And this journey that we go on together.
I love that. So what happened when you had your second child? How did that kind of add a new layer? Because I think, people are asking me all the time, like, how much harder is it to have 2 or to have 3? And the answer is it's a lot. It's like 100% harder to have an additional child and human. So did that, kind of further change your career trajectory at all? Or did you feel like you kind of had it all down by then?
So I had always had the flexible career, which I didn't mind because it allowed me to do the kind of writing I wanted to do. My husband was also a journalist, and he was at the time a staff reporter at the New York Times. But when both of our kids were born, he was a staff reporter at the time. So it was just the first time they didn't have paternity leave yet. Mm-hmm. And he left the house. He had the kind of bigger job. He made more money. But at the same time, like he had more external definition of his work, and I had more freedom and flexibility. So, in many ways it was worse for me, but in many ways it was worse for him too. And better, for both of us in other ways. So I think when Levi came along, I had gotten paid care help. I had hired a nanny pretty early on with Augie because I had no maternity leave. I had this flexible work lifestyle, so I was able to slowly add more and more care over time. And I also knew I was alone all day in the house, and after 1 month, like, that's not psychologically healthy and not going to help any of us. So kind of quickly sought out care with Augie, and also knowing that even if it seems expensive right now, overall I think the long-term investment was wise. So with Levi, I had the same idea that, like, after the paternity leave, I was going to get care pretty quickly. I did miss my work. I knew that having a mix of work and being with my kids was a good balance for me, and I think a good balance for them. And also, while I would love to live in some idealized society like we spoke about before, where there's a beautiful organic exchange of children among caregivers, like, the reality is my option was to get that, what anthropologists call the allo-parent experience, but this kind of collective care network. The only way I was going to get that was through paying for help. So I hired a nanny pretty early on with Levi, and it allowed me to kind of get back to work pretty quickly. And I felt like I had already had a sense of Augie, had learned with Augie how to transition between mom self and worker self, of just kind of shut that door. I have good discipline that way. I trusted my nanny. Like, I knew if I was going to hire a nanny, I was going to trust the nanny. And I knew that, and this gets back to something I already said, like, let them bring themselves to the job, because my kids will get more from the nanny if the nanny can show up as her full self. And maybe she's going to feed them food. I wouldn't feed them. That definitely happened. Or they would be, maybe on a screen at a moment. I wouldn't put them on a screen, or all these things that feel, they're big decisions. Like, just kind of set some boundaries. It wasn't like it was free range, but also just let them be done with the kids. And so I was able to really close that door, metaphorically speaking and literally speaking, when I was at work and the kids I'm in the other room with the nanny, and love it and feel like I'm free. Like, I get to have someone else care for my kid. So that was kind of the practical transition with 2 kids for me. in terms of the kind of spiritual, psychological, philosophical transition, I think having the second kid hit home even more that if I parent from this checklist place, if I parent from this kind of instrumental place that like my kids are supposed to do this and they're supposed to do X, Y, and Z on this timeline, the whole thing would be terrible. Mm. And if I parent from a place of curiosity and receptivity and trying to understand this one and only child, then actually I'm going to enjoy this thing a lot more. I'm going to be less likely to compare myself to other parents or compare my kids to other kids. And also going to be maybe a better parent to this kid. And then if the whole attachment theory works, have a better kid in return because the kid's going to feel like attuned to. And so I think even more the second time, it was like this whole new kid, a whole new opportunity to really try to ditch the checklist and just receive this child.
Yeah. That second kid and third kid, they will humble you because they make you realize that like no checklist matters. No book really can tell you how to do everything right with every child because they're all so different. And I love that you talked about that flexibility with your work too. And that's been so helpful for me as well with my second and third babies to be flexible and to be home. Some moms also decide that they don't want to continue working or that it makes more sense for their family to not continue with their jobs once they have kids. And I think that can also be a really lonely and isolating experience in our country to be a stay-at-home parent. How can we get the most out of caregiving? This is something that you talk about.
So yeah, I think one good place to start with this is money, because money, whether listeners like it or not, we live in a capitalistic society and money equals value. And I'll start by way of anecdote. So when I dug into the economic research on care for that chapter of my book, first of all, I learned that literally since the creation of the GDP, a Scottish economist named Phyllis Dean went to Africa with this group of economists that were creating this whole thing of like, how do we measure value in society? Since the beginning, there was a woman there. I was like, I think you're forgetting something. You're forgetting domestic labor. You're missing what all these women are doing. So it's been going on forever. Like, how do we value care economically? And we've failed to account for it properly forever. But what I did is I looked at and I'm a shitty mathematician. I just want to qualify that. I'm no economist. But I looked at the way that these contemporary feminist economists are trying to put a dollar sign on care and all their formulas they use. And I used it for our household. And when I did that, I saw that the gender gap was gone in my household. That I basically had earned as much as my husband earns when I account for both the earned income I make and the fact that I spend all this extra time compared to him caring. And I think that I just want to start with that anecdote because I think it's like really just an eye-opening way of showing that if we had listened to this Scottish woman, almost 100 years ago, and we had really thought of ways to value care, maybe people who stay home would be able to see that actually they are contributing a lot to our society in dollars, in economic terms. One other fun little, way of looking at this is when women first entered the workforce in very high numbers in the 1970s, at first economists thought productivity had gone up. But then some have gone back and looked at that research. Like, wait a minute, if we valued productivity in the home, actually productivity maybe went down. And it's like these are such big picture ways to view the work we do inside our home. But if we can really internalize it, it's a profound shift. Like, this is really productive labor. This actually is fueling the economy. This is actually incubating future citizens, future employees, future mothers and fathers who can provide good care and create healthy kids themselves. And like it is a huge, huge mattering engine, and we just fail to account for it again and again. Yeah.
So one big way then is to really just know your value and know your worth, and to not feel like you're not contributing to your household or to society or to your partnership. What other ways do you suggest that parents kind of get fulfillment out of caregiving?
It's really time to see care particularly caring for small children, is the hero's journey, so to speak, that it actually is. So we have this great model for a hero's journey. We have, all these great, like the Odyssey, all these great warriors that leave the home and find truth and epiphany. Then there's tons of Disney movies with that model, Finding Nemo. It's always about all these stories in our head of like, what's a hero's journey? What does it mean to do something difficult but come back enlightened? Always involve people leaving the home, leaving their family to find that truth. And I think if like there's kind of one framing that I wish all mothers put on their care experiences, and this is whether they work outside the home for money or don't work outside the home for money, everyone, is to see this as the Odyssey, to see it as the Iliad, see it as this great hero's journey. It just happens to be taking place in your home, and it happens to involve actually growing your family, not leaving your family behind. Because the philosophical insights that you get from caring for another person, from having this little human in your arms that you're suddenly supposed to understand, are enormous. I'd also add the spiritual layer to it. I write about this in my book. Parenting was kind of left out in meaningful ways from most of our major religions. There's a nice kind of pat on the back for mothers in a lot of religious traditions, but nothing deeper than that. Nothing that said, oh, mothers, you're not just great, but actually like come and lead our community, because through care, you've like tapped into something richer and deeper, and we want to learn from you. I mean, if someone has a correction to that, I'm all ears. I couldn't find a beautiful example of that. Now, maybe like with feminists working their way through big religious traditions and trying to make those changes. But historically speaking, it was the pat on the back. It's the Hallmark card, like best job in the world. Keep doing it. I also think that kind of politically and ethically, parenting can be such a deeply formative experience. It really changes your sense of what society owes you, what you owe society, what a healthy collective looks like. It can be politically motivating in all directions, really, but still, it as much as it pulls you into yourself and into that creature, it also really pulls you out of yourself. And so this kind of stereotypical mother who's just obsessed with her own kid is just so wrong, And this is where I resist the fairy tale nightmare thing, because this process is messy. It is hard, as to borrow, the kind of Catholic phrase. There are many dark souls of the night. It is not to have this profound experience, to go on this hero's journey with parenthood. There's tears. There's, there's sweat. There's poo. Maybe there's blood too, but there's definitely blood with childbirth. There's all of that. And I think if we can widen the aperture, broaden that frame, I think when moms are doing the work of mothering, whether it's the small stuff or the big stuff, it's gonna come with such a different energy for them. Yeah.
What is something, this is my last question for you, what is something that you wish was talked about more? What's something no one told you about becoming a parent or about motherhood that you wish you had been a little more prepared for?
I think for me, it really was this kind of profound ethical and philosophical experience that it really challenged so much of what I thought about myself and what I thought about the world. And I knew I was anticipating identity shifts and how I existed in the world, kind of external identity shifts. But I really don't feel like anyone explained how big and profound the internal identity shifts are. Yeah. And so it's not just about, can I pump at the office? And it's not just about like, well, my friends want to hang out with me now that I have a baby. But it's like, oh, who am I, Elissa Strauss, now that I have these two kids? And not just to view that as a taking away, but also a getting and a giving and receiving. Because to the degree that I did hear about it, it was the nightmare. It's like motherhood's going to siphon off everything good about you instead of this beautiful, rich, challenging friction.
I totally agree with that. Where can people find you? Where can people connect with your work? And where can people get your book?
So my book, When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others, is available at all major booksellers. It's on Amazon, and I am the last person to judge a busy mom for ordering a book on Amazon.
Thank you for that.
I read books on Amazon. I know we all shouldn't, but listen, it shows up at your door. I also have a Substack called Made with Care, and I am on Instagram, relatively newly so, since the publication of this book, and my handle is at Elissa Avery.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I hope everyone will pick up your book and learn a little something about what it means to care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are you a parent in need of a laugh and a little escape? Look no further. Parenting is a Joke is the podcast you've been waiting for. Hey, I'm Ophira Eisenberg. I'm a stand-up comic and parent. And each week I chat with one of my top comedian pals who, just like you, are juggling careers, busy lives and schedules, and raising a family. You can expect candid stories, hilarious mishaps that happen on stage and at home, and just a lot of laughs. There's no expert advice here. Well, actually, sometimes a good idea does sneak its way in, but mostly just pure, relatable fun to remind you that we're all in this parenting adventure together. New episodes of Parenting is a Joke drop every Tuesday, so tune in, get ready to laugh, unwind, and maybe even feel a little bit better about your own parenting. Because sometimes that's exactly what your therapist, pediatrician, and bartender ordered. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform.